Okay,
Okay.
I want to welcome all the folks here today to join us for Asset Discovery. You can't secure what you can't see. This is session 2 of our Genesis CXO Cyber Series. My name is Terry, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So if you have any questions along the way or technical difficulties, reach out to me directly, and we'll try to fix that along the way. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this today. You should have seen that when you came into Zoom. And we will make that recording available by the end of the day today on our YouTube channel. Secondly, for all of you who are using Zoom and have done hundreds of these, you probably know how to adjust the panelists and things in there. We're not going to have a ton of slides. So up in the top right screen, if you're not aware of that, you can adjust the view into a speaker view or a gallery view, and you can make those pictures a little bit bigger so you can look at everybody. And then we only have 1 or 2 slides along the way here, so we'll pop those up as we need to. If you have questions, put those in the Q&A or chat pane. And when we are done with the town hall discussion, we're actually going to go to a live Q&A, and I'll give you a couple more ways to do that once we get to that portion. So let me flip the next slide here and introduce our panelists, if I can get it to move. First of all is Corey White. He's the founder and CEO of Cyvatar. Also joining us is Nathan Burke, who is the Chief Marketing Officer over at Axonius. And we also have Craig Goodwin. He's the Chief Trust and Risk Officer over at Fujitsu. And also joining us is Jeff Farinich. He's the VP of Infrastructure and Security at New American Funding. I'm going to pass this over to Corey to get started.
Okay, awesome. So we start with the important stuff first. And the important stuff is, since last week we've launched, Cyvatar Cares, which is the charity that we donate to, and it's very, very important that we realize that pretty much all of us on this call, we're blessed to be able to know where our next meal comes from, even though I did not have breakfast and I'm drinking beer for breakfast, I guess, but at least we know where our next meal comes from. But there's so many people that, especially with this coronavirus, they don't know where that's coming from. And, kids in LA and pretty much, every major city, out there, they're dependent on their lunches and breakfast sometimes to get that meal. And now that's gone away, we want to make sure that the food banks actually have enough food to continue to feed, in many cases, even now the parents. So we're taking our blessings and making sure we donate. So every single time we do one of these, and instead of us, originally the series, we were supposed to be at a nice hotel in, I think, Newport Beach or whatever. But instead of doing that, which I think this is actually way better, we're doing webinars, and we've partnered today with Axonius and Nathan, and they are donating to Eat, Learn, Play, which is, who's the?
It's Steph Curry's foundation.
Steph Curry. Okay, that's right. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about Eat, Learn, Play? Sure. He wants to say Eat, Love, Play, but Eat, Learn, Play.
I screw it up all the time myself. Yeah, so we've been working with Eat, Learn, Play for a while now. It's Steph Curry's foundation. Steph and Aisha Curry, they're right now providing, I think it's 300,000 meals a week to kids in the Oakland area. So they're working with food banks, but their whole idea is those 3 things, right? Eat, being able to make sure that kids that are going to school that aren't able to have a meal, learn, obviously supporting the schools, and then play. And that's, an important part through sports. So we've been supporting this charity for, I don't know, 6 months, maybe longer. Love it. And we think it's a great thing. And right now, during the thing I'm not going to mention, they're providing 300,000 meals a week to kids in the Oakland area.
Wow, that is just fantastic. Great charity. And I love the fact that you guys have been doing this for 6 months, even, before. And one of the keys around Cyvatar is partnering with companies that are interested in being socially responsible, because that's one of the goals of Cyvatar, is being socially responsible and donating a portion of our funds, our revenue to Cyvatar Cares, so that we are also giving back as we continue to grow. So perfect. Next slide.
Actually, I'm going to stop sharing. You can start the conversation.
Okay. All right. Real quick. So I think let's dive into like a 30-second kind of introduction of the team. You know, Nathan, then Craig, then Jeff, and then we'll dive into some of our questions.
Cool. Yep. So thanks. Nathan Burke, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Axonius. This is my third cybersecurity company. I'm at it again. I love it. And just excited to be part of this and to talk a little bit about something that we talk about every day, which is asset management.
Cool. Craig Goodwin, CISO for about 15, 16 years now, I guess. Started with the UK government and then larger US-based technology companies. Currently Chief Risk and Trust Officer at Fujitsu, so leading efforts on customer delivery across Fujitsu, about 195,000 employees across the globe. Very passionate about delivering business outcomes from security, and excited about making sure that we do the basics well, which is why I'm here.
Great, and hello, Jeff Frenich. I'm the VP of Infrastructure and Security at New American Funding. I've worked many years in a global tech company. Company name was NDS, bought by Cisco, and worked at Cisco a few years, and then also recently at Schools First Federal Credit Union. So I've been about security about 20 plus years, and currently at New American, I'm the head of security.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining. And Jeff, you know, when we sat down, one of the things that I really loved about your overall program, I know you about 6 months in, but you had everything dialed in. You've done so much research, looked at so many different vendors and products and solutions. And one of the things that Savitar does is we map our solutions back to compliance, and you had done the exact same thing. So it was interesting. And we were on a call yesterday talking about some other things. And you mentioned, you know, you've looked at all the full spectrum. So I appreciate you coming into the call here today at last minute and being a part of it. So we're going to dive in, and you know, you guys know me. I want to ask the hard questions and understand, you know, what the hell is going on out there from a asset management perspective. And this is my own personal perspective. You know, I've obviously been doing cybersecurity for 25 years now, and I just almost never see companies have a handle on asset management or frankly even care about it. So I'm just curious, why don't CISOs, you know, if they're building a program, why isn't that the first thing that they start doing day one? What assets do I have and how do I secure them? What does it look like? Why isn't that ever done? So Craig, I'll let you dive in and answer that first, but Jeff, I'm curious of your thoughts.
Oh yeah, no worries. I'll solve it for you, Corey, right now. So I think look, I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a couple of key points. I think you mentioned it there, right? It's hard, really hard. And I think that's point number one, right? You join an organization as a CISO, you might be there first, you might not be there first, but it's a really tough thing to get your arms around. So I think that's number one. It's a really hard thing. And there's lots of other stuff that security folks want to focus on that are much more shiny, much more exciting, right? So solving asset management probably isn't the first thing you want to think about when you're trying to make an impact when you join an organization. And then, you know, a second thing, I think, you know, when you think about asset management, you often think it's not my problem as a CISO, right? And we could talk for ages about where a CISO should report, you know, what a CISO does in terms of role. And we all, probably everyone on this call knows that it's different and depends on the organization that you're talking about. But asset management is often not something that's seen as the purview of the CISO or the security function, you know? So often a CISO will say, I shouldn't be doing that, right? I want the CIO to do that, or, you know, I want IT or hosting or whoever it is should be providing that as a service to me. And therefore, you know, the CISOs don't see it as their problem to fix. And then I think thirdly, I would say that, you know, as you go after all the top 10 things on your list that you've got as a CISO, what you tend to do is draw a line under the legacy stuff. So there's been a lot of press, a lot of things on LinkedIn about the tenure of a CISO, right? And when you join an organization, you know, you look at the things that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And quite frankly, it's hard to admit that you haven't been doing asset management right for a long time and you want to go and do things over again. You know, so I think when you go into an organization and you want to start new, it's not the first thing you go after. And therefore you want to add it to the list somewhere rather than going after it first. Problem is, ultimately, and I'll pass over to the other guys now, a lot of the programs you then subsequently try and run will ultimately fail because you haven't got that bedrock of asset management to help to support it. So
wait,
I'll start there and see.
So if your turnover is 18 to 24 months, then you're not going to spend it with the unsexy stuff of discovering assets. You're going to find out all the high risk stuff where you can be compromised, all that good stuff. And then you might go back to asset, but if you go back to it, they're going to ask, why didn't you ask this at the beginning? So it ends up just being ignored completely.
Exactly. All of those things.
Okay. Jeff, is that what you're doing? Come on, man.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm lucky or unlucky. I wear both hats, right? I'm in charge of IT and security, so assets are my problem. And where I'm at now, we hire a lot of employees. There's some churn, but also we hire a lot. So we go to about 30, 40 asset changes, per week just on the endpoints.
Wow.
So besides it being a financial investment, we want to make sure we have a grasp on. I also want to know, is that asset secure as it moves around the organization? And if I can't find it, I want to have it disabled on the network, so it can't get on.
Well, yeah, and I think you raise a great point there, Jeff, as well about the concept of assets in general, right? What the hell do we even mean by an asset, right? So you mentioned endpoints there, and I think as a CISO, trying to get a grasp on, you look at one of those crazy CISO maps that get shared, you're getting a grasp on what you really mean by an asset, whether it's a desktop, like you say, whether it's an operational server, whether it's applications and code, all those kind of things.
Exactly. I mean, servers are pretty easy to keep track of for the most part. But, I want to know every device on the network, whether it's a network, a server, or other. If it's accessing my network, it's good to know where it's at. So I can understand what the controls that are in place for it.
All right. So Nathan, is this what you're saying to people? Do you have like a slew of CISOs coming to you saying, hey, I just took a new CISO job. Let's get asset figured out because it's like number 1 and 2 on the CIS controls checklist. Is that what you're getting right now?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things. There's one, I mean, if someone is just starting a new role, then there you go, right? They're just trying to say, what do I have? Give me the landscape. Help me understand what's covered by what is matching my policy, what's deviating from that. And then there's the other angles where someone is trying to solve a specific problem. Like I failed an audit, or I've got some kind of compliance that I've got to prove, and I just don't have a way of doing it. So it comes from multiple angles. And just back to the beginning, and I think you said it, Corey, which is like the sexy part. So I don't know if you see this video, if you're watching this, but right ahead on top of me here is the banner that we got from the Innovation Sandbox. And that's what we said, is that, asset management is the least sexy problem in cybersecurity. We actually call it the Toyota Camry of cybersecurity, right? It's that thing that it's not sexy, it's not shiny, it's not cool, but like you said, if you don't get that right, then you're not going to get the rest of it right. And so, yeah, that's exactly right.
I think you're being too kind. I think it's like Datsun of cybersecurity. If you don't know what a Datsun is, then you can Google it.
But I think Corey as well, right? You're giving the CISOs a hard time here, but I think, throwing it right back over to you two, I think that's been vendor driven to some extent as well, right? And one of the things that I noticed at RSA this year, which is perhaps me being a bit too positive, was actually there's a bit of a shift back to basics again, right? And for so many years, it's been focused on AI, ML. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but actually there's a lot of the CISOs there who would say, I don't need to buy that yet. I'm not mature enough to buy that yet. I've got a load of basics to sort out first. So I think from a vendor perspective as well, I saw a little bit of a shift this year back to that more basic stuff again.
Yeah, and I think just to your point, it's also a shift to trying to solve a problem, right? Like there's very few times in cybersecurity that we actually solve a problem.
Yeah.
Right. When you look at security, it's a matter of getting ahead when it's about detection or prevention. Whereas if something can actually solve a problem, and it's fine to be basic. And when we won the Innovation Sandbox, people were walking up and saying, "Oh, you're the unsexy guy." I'm totally fine with that because it means they remembered us, right? I will wear that badge every day. And have no problem with it. And
it means
but that is the thing.
You work out, you don't go to the gym, you drink beer all the time. Completely unsexy.
I can even drink non-alcoholic beer and not get made fun of.
Nice. Okay. So I think that ties back to, and Jeff, you've actually have solved it, but the power struggle between the CIO and the CISO. And is that why asset management is not being done? Because, you know, CISOs are saying it's not my problem. Yeah, let the CIO handle it. But if I'm the CISO, it actually is your problem because you can't secure what you don't know you have. And so is that what is happening? And so you just finally you figured out just do both roles and call it a day? Is that the answer?
Oh, I can't say I figured it out. And in my organization, you know, there was a much smaller IT team before I got there. So it's not quite as mature as probably larger organizations. But, you know, as we get larger, I'm sure there'll be the need for more of a dual role between different individuals. But in the near term, you know, I wear both hats and control both teams. So I guess when I make progress, it's easy because, you know, they're all under me. I can't make excuses.
So Craig, how have you done it over your years? You've been CISO, you know, several places and dealt with CIOs, and so how do you get it done?
Well, so I think, you know, we don't want to go into the rabbit hole about reporting lines and, you know, the CISO reporting where that's a whole nother conversation, right? But I think
to say it depends.
Yeah, well, we can, but you need another 3 hours. But I think so. So there's a couple of things. So me, you, and Malcolm touched on it in the last conversation we had, actually, in the last webcast, when we talked about, you know, CISOs taking accountability for driving business outcomes, right? And I think we talked about there, you know, that the CISOs of the old school tend to look at it and say, well, actually, it's just my job to find the holes. And I think that problem is perennial within this conversation, right? Because, okay, you're not finding a vulnerability or a security hole, but you're highlighting something that the organization isn't doing very well. And a lot of CISOs will say, well, I'll throw that over the fence to a CIO, to an IT organization and say, well, you need to fix it, rather than seeing it as a joint effort to drive that forward, you know? And if I internalize that as a CISO and say, well, actually, it's my problem they don't have good asset management, they don't understand why I need good asset management, and therefore it's a problem of communication, it's a problem of partnership, right? And that's about me loading my Starbucks card, taking the CIO out for a coffee, and doing a bit of a sales job about why security need that as a really strong base in order to help me to drive risk down, you know? So I think we've got to internalize that problem as an industry, and we've got to utilize that as a partnership-based approach, regardless of where you report in the organization. And I think that leads us on to, you know, one of the other points, and one of the questions I was going to ask of Nathan was, you know, when you're talking about that example of people coming to you, Nathan, and saying, you know, we need to do this better, is that generally CISOs and security people that you're seeing, or is that CIOs, IT directors, you know, who have been forced by the CISO to go and do it? Where's the motivation coming from?
Yeah, it really depends on the problem that they're trying to solve. In some cases, if it's something like compliance or auditing or overall policy validation enforcement, that sort of thing, it could come from the high level of the CISO of someone at that level. If it's someone trying to solve a problem like, I can't find which of my endpoints are missing an agent, right? So it really depends on the problem that they're trying to solve. So the more acute the problem, the more hands-on it is, the more kind of, I don't want to say like theoretical, but the more high level the problem, the higher it goes. And in fact, in almost every situation, it involves both, right? So if it's someone saying, I need to make sure that we comply with CIS controls, or if it's someone saying, we've got this audit coming up, it's always going to go down to the person that has to implement it and prove it and actually implement the technology. And the same goes the other way. If someone's saying, I want to solve a problem, then it generally goes up when it comes to signing the check anyway. So it's almost always both ways, especially the bigger the organization.
It's interesting, you know, you listen to both of you guys talk, and I'll throw it back on myself. You know, providing cybersecurity services for the last 25 years. What used to happen is, and we would do an external assessment or and realize, hey, you have this, you know, system external facing that is has these ports open or this application open and is vulnerable to an attack, and then, you know, the CISO will come back, we didn't know we had that. That shouldn't have been there. Who put that there? And so you think about that, you know, the problem is, if they had actually done asset management appropriately, and they were managing asset management and change control as well appropriately, then that system would not end up being out on the internet exposed but most of a lot of the incidents that I've been called in to do as well end up being they had that exposure to the internet that they did not know they had, and it got compromised, and then that led to them being overall compromised. So we've been doing it backwards. The assessments and penetration testing and all that stuff is actually pointing out the challenge with asset management. And I think, and Craig, you even pointed this out, where you can tie scans with your asset management tool and make sure they're in sync. You want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. So one of the programs that we've built in the past, and actually, Nathan, we saw your technology is capable of doing that, right? Is actually pushing it the other way. So, you get proactive with your security program. I always use, so good analogy, I don't know whether this is good or not, I haven't tested it and I've had half a glass of wine, so let's see if it works. But I used to tell the story about going to jump on a tube train in London, right? And I was going to a security conference, and the tube train, they go, like the New York ones do, every couple of seconds, like they're banging away. And you run down the steps, and I saw that this tube train was about to leave and I needed to get on it, right? So I ran down the steps, dived through the doors, and the doors just closed behind me. So I just managed to get onto this tube train. And I kind of stood up, as you do, celebrating my success by the fact that I dived on. Looked around myself, and there's a couple of guys sat there who've been playing with their phone for 5 minutes, not sweating, perfectly composed. And actually, it struck me that, what we've been doing as a security industry is celebrating just getting through that door for so long. We've just managed to grab a project before it's gone out the door, or we've just grabbed an asset before it's got stuck on the public internet, and we're celebrating the fact that we're just surviving by the skin of our teeth, rather than trying to build it in from the train from the outset and be proactive and be the guy that sat there playing with his phone for 5 minutes. So to your point, Corey, if you start with those basics, and Jeff said he's using it, I've just been this massive proponent of taking those basic controls and just working from that from the outset. So whether you're a brand new CISO or whether you're, been there for a few years, you can reevaluate, take a step back and say, are we doing things like asset management well? And then you take your asset management tool and you push that out to your Qualys or your Nessus or whatever scanner you're using, and then scan that backwards, rather than going to a pen testing company or a vulnerability scanner and saying, find my assets. Do it the other way around and be proactive about it,
Yeah, so actually, Craig, just to go on your point there, I think that's a good metaphor and a good analogy there for looking at normal devices, right? Like looking at laptops and physical devices. But now when you're talking about adding cloud and the ability to spin up a VM in like 10 seconds and never even think about it again, and then forget about like IoT devices, right? So now it's, instead of every 2 minutes, they're every 10 seconds, and some of them just disappear.
Yeah.
Right? So you might not even see it before it showed up, existed for a second, then went away. And so one of the things we just did was we did a survey with one of the analyst firms around IT complexity, and we're asking just about why are our environments getting harder and harder to manage, in public cloud, in dynamic devices, ephemeral stuff, IoT. These are all things that people are worried about. And if it's difficult to get asset management right when you're just talking about devices on a network, absolutely, add on these things that are just kind of weird. And back to are they an asset?
Yeah.
Is a user an asset? Like all of these things just make it so much more difficult, such that you just can't unring that bell. And trying to catch up to those things once you're fully in the cloud, you're using all types of devices, everyone's remote, man, that's hard.
Yeah. Well, if I had 10 pence or 10 cents, if we're talking to a US audience, for every time a developer told me that, spinning up an instance isn't an asset, then, I'd be a rich man. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, Shodan disagrees with that.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think both of you guys just made my next point. I just think asset management is too hard, and we probably should go ahead and just stop the webinar now and give up, right? Is that the plan?
Or
But I mean, that's the thing, right? And I think that honestly has been the challenge over, let's just say the 25 years we've been doing cybersecurity, since the mid 90s. And it's a challenge. How do you get it? And I think it's even more complicated now, because we hadn't even defined what an asset is. So we hadn't even defined what an asset is. And then there's, dynamic cloud environments and developers spinning up new stuff all the time. How can you actually get this figured out? And I think, Jeff may know the answer to this, or is trying to figure out the answer to this. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I mean, trying to figure it out, I did match my asset management or scanning with vulnerability management. That's kind of helped. But once again, as I mentioned, there's still some gaps. So I want to go to the next stage and mature it out more.
What do you consider the next stage? What does that next stage look like for you?
Working with Nathan, hopefully.
There we go.
Nice. And so I want to take a second. What is legacy asset management? What did everybody used to do? And in my head, I'm thinking about the Excel spreadsheet. And I've seen many of those over the years, the Excel spreadsheet, or I'll never forget a good CISO friend of mine. We were coming in to do a vulnerability assessment, and it was also, we were going to install Silence as well. But he always made me think, and I probably should get him on one of these calls, but he said, Corey, my problem is I don't know what assets I have. So I cannot tell you the scope. I cannot tell you what those systems are. I have no freaking idea. And so I need you to figure out what those assets are, go into a full discovery scan. And then once you tell me that, then you can assess it. But I don't know what it is. I'm stuck. I mean, I think that is systemic in the industry. If you don't know what you have, you cannot secure it. So I'm sure you guys are seeing that.
Yeah, and I think where they can add real value, so I'll throw it to Nathan because I know he's desperate to talk. But I think, yeah, hand up virtually. So I think you're right, Corey. And I think where I've seen most power from a vendor perspective is when they partner with that CISO to give visibility, right? So that's a great example that you just gave there. And actually where I've been most successful in working with vendors is when they give you that power to build a story for your organization, right? So I talked about communication earlier. I think where vendors can really help is to see the value in helping the CISO to build the story rather than just selling to the CISO. You know, here's the visibility. Here's how we can help you to articulate the problem for your stakeholders, be it the CIO or be it the board or whoever it is, and build that story in a partnership way that can help the CISO to be successful. You know, I don't know what you're seeing, Nathan.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I wanted to just give two quick stories instead of just me talking about product all day. But I want to tell you this one first, because the first day that I joined Axonius, so it was before we ever had a product. And so we were doing calls with CISOs. And my first day, I go in there thinking I know what I'm talking about. You know where this goes. I didn't. And we go on this call with this massive, Fortune 100 customer. And I actually said to the CISO, so tell me how many devices you have. And 90 seconds go by. I swear to you. And I'm like, did the phone drop? And she just started laughing. And I'm like, what's going on? And she goes, I have no idea. And if somebody tells you they do, they're lying to you. And it just struck me as like, this is that real problem. And then our CEO, Dean, said it best the other day when he said, if you go to someone that has kids and say, how many kids do you have? And they say between 3 and 5, that's not a very good answer. And so that's really how it is. But
I'm gonna start saying that, by the way. Yeah.
What's that?
I'm gonna start saying that between 2 and 3.
Yeah, exactly. Somewhere in the middle. I'm not really sure. Depends. It's like,
well, you can make a great joke about the Prime Minister in the UK there. I don't know how familiar you are with UK politics, but it's a bit of a myth to how many children Boris Johnson's got. He'll never directly answer the question. So there you
go. Okay.
But then after those two things, I think the good news is, other than just saying, buy a product, is that it's not a problem of you don't have the information. Whereas it used to be before, right? Like the challenge of asset management a long time ago was that you didn't have the information, but that's not it now. Mm-hmm. The problem now is you have all of the information about all of the assets. They're just in different places. And so whether you're talking about us as a product, but I want to talk about the approach. And I think this is true whether you're going to try to do this on your own or whatever. The idea is you have all of these systems that know about assets. If you're able to just bring that information together and correlate it together and know that an asset is an asset is an asset, then you're able to do these things. So it's a very different challenge today. Now that everything has an API and you can actually get at that data, it's not easy, I'll tell you that, but it's possible. And it's just a different challenge than it used to be.
Yeah, well, again, I'm going old school. I mean, come on, man. I can just run SNMP scans and ARP scans and of my network and pull that, right? Why don't I just do that?
So you could, and that would be one decent input, but it's the correlation piece that's the hard part, right? It is. And just being able to if I went to my VA scanner and said, how many devices do I have? And I went to AD, and then I went to my endpoint protection, you're going to get a different number, right? It's just not that easy. And plus, right now, we're all sitting at our homes, right? So we're probably not touching the network, but maybe we're logging in through IAM, so IAM knows about us. So it's no longer easy enough to say everything is on my network in my physical location. Everything has an endpoint protection platform on it. Everything's being scanned. It's not as easy because of remote, because of cloud, because of IoT, because of everything else. But I will say that it is to say that you do have the information. It's just in a bunch of different places. So it's out there. It's not something you can just do through the network. It's not something you can just do through saying, well, I've got Tanium on my Windows machines. That's great. All of those are awesome inputs. So that the data is there. It's just the challenge of bringing it all together and correlating it so you can understand that kind of Venn diagram of what's covered, what isn't but doesn't matter, what isn't but should be.
And I always get the hardest board question I ever get is always, you know, what about the stuff that we don't know about? Now, how you answer that question is just incredibly difficult, right? But it's always those things that you don't know about. And talking about, you know, assets in a most general sense, some of probably the last two largest breaches, and I know there's a lot now, have been as a result of marketing type websites, right? That weren't running on equipment that was internal, but were websites that had been spun up by someone in the organization that for all intents and purposes were classed as an asset for the organization. And it was a route into the company, right? So it's not a physical asset. There's no laptop anywhere, but there is a DNS registration and there's a website sat somewhere that belongs to that organization and maps back into their internal infrastructure. So, you know, and then the other thing is, you know, we talked about what exists on that asset, which is incredibly important. So you think about assets generally, I've had organizations where you've got, I don't know, 10 different websites or 50 different products all mapped to the same server, for example. So it's fantastic knowing that you've got a physical server sat somewhere, but actually what's more important is the connection and what exists on that box as well, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's one you see all the time, but then you've also got things like backups of backups of backups of backups, right? Like so one of my favorite sites to look at is, it's not Shodan, it's a Gray Hat Warfare, which is like something that indexes publicly available EC2 instances, S3 buckets, whatever. And when you look at those publicly available cloud instances, you end up finding that, and I just did this for fun, which doesn't say a lot about my free time, but I was just looking at these things, and you find out when you contact the owner that no one thought that anything was going to be public there, or, you know, that's just our marketing website. But wait a second, what system is backing up files there? And you find out you've got all of these files with PII and all this other stuff, and people are saying like, why did this get here in the first place? And so it's misconfiguration, but it's also, we're just throwing data all over the place and we don't know where it's ending up.
I don't know how I can lose any more respect for you, Nathan. You're drinking non-alcoholic beer, and now I know what you do in your spare time.
Just wait longer.
Yeah,
Nathan, I agree with your comments. I mean, there is really no single source of truth, but you have multiple sources of data, which combined become that single source.
Yep.
Oh, all right, Jeff, you opened it up. What is an asset?
Well, I mean, for me, it's anything that will access a network or has data on it. So as I try to work towards zero trust, you know, it's about people and it's about assets and tying them together and controlling them.
It's like identity is an asset, right? So I saw a question posed on LinkedIn the other day about identity being an asset in of itself, right? So moving away from that old school physical asset, actually your identity, regardless of where you're accessing the network from or what on, should be classed as an asset effectively, right? Do you deal with that in Axonius, Nathan? Is that something that you?
Yeah, we do. So we look at any device, so anything that has an IP address and compute, and then we try to look at the intersection between that and the solutions that secure them, but also things like, you know, a cloud instance or an account, right? So it's all of those together. So just to give an example of what that would mean is, let's say that I'm looking for my Amazon instances not being scanned by a VA scanner. And so I find that, and then I say, well, wait a second, there's 24,000 of them, can't do anything there. But then let me only look at those with public IP addresses. Cool. So I go from there and say, well, I want to know what's on it. I want to know what else knows about it. I want to know who's logged in. I want to know anything about the accounts. Have the tokens been changed in 90 days, whatever. So it's all of those that you can move to. And like, from an incident response perspective, I get an alert from a SIM, tells me about a device. Now I want to know who has been logged in. Have they changed their password in X amount of days? Have their credentials been in a public breach, and have I been pwned? So it's like trying to understand where you can pivot to based on the devices, the coverage, and who has access.
Agreed. Looking at the time here, it's 40 after. Let's go for 5 more minutes, and then we'll jump into some questions. I know there are already some questions in the chat. If there are more questions, please add your questions, and we'll jump into those in 5 minutes. So I think the last piece for me is I'm curious, because I always feel like I'm missing something. I'll start with you, Jeff. What are we missing? What didn't we talk about as it relates to asset management? What is that area that is just that big elephant that we're not seeing right now as it relates to it? What is that?
I didn't hear you mention of the software assets, right? We have all these devices and servers of software. But what actually is a valid license? Are we over licensed, under licensed? So as part of cost containment, I want to make sure I know what's the valid use of that license.
That's a great point. Nathan, do you help with that, or how you approach that?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't track it down to like the number of licenses versus what you bought. We can look at it in terms of deployment, in terms of what version of what software is installed, who has access to it. So one of the things I saw today is the federal government is now temporarily rolling out Teams to everyone. That ought to be interesting. But one of the things that we can see is how many users are actually using it, and how many devices, and like looking at those concentric circles there. So we don't track it down to like a dollar figure. It's certainly something we've heard customers ask us about. There are other solutions that do that. So one of the things we do is we integrate with like 217 different solutions out there. So there's a certain stopping point where we say, there's already stuff out there that does that. Let's just integrate with it. And so that's one of the ones that we generally don't do, because there's a lot of solutions out there that can track to the dollar and tell if you're spending too much and what you have up for expiration and that sort of thing. So we mainly look at like the deployment, things that are missing agents or something that's not working, or we can look at, say, like, let's say a vulnerability in Chrome comes out tomorrow. We can then in a search just say, show me every Windows device that has this version of Chrome or Flash or whatever, or like Zoom. That's one we get asked a lot about right now, which is show me anyone that has Zoom installed, but it's this version. They haven't done the upgrade because I want to go yell at them. So we do it to that level. We don't get down to like the dollar figure.
What about, we haven't mentioned yet categorization of the IT assets, right? Because we've talked about assets generally, but clearly, you can't do everything, right? And certainly in huge organizations, you're going to be in a tough situation to spend, if we even get that long as a CISO, 10 years, there's not many of them, right? But if you get that long to build a full asset program, you're going to be lucky, right? So actually what's critical to me as a CISO is the criticality of those assets and what I really should be focusing my efforts on. How are you approaching that, Nathan?
Yeah, so we do it a couple of different ways. So one is just within Axonius, you're able to search and tag and do whatever you want to categorize your different assets by writing queries, which are really a translation of policy. The second thing we do there is we integrate with all the CMDBs. So if you're doing some of that through CMDB, we can enrich the data about every asset within the CMDB, so you don't have to manually do that. Long story short is it all depends on how the customer wants to do it. Some people really care about it by devices on segmented networks and show me any, what I would call a rogue device, which really is more of a, this shouldn't be here rather than malicious intent. So the way that we try to architect everything is we want to let the customer decide how they want to do it. So you kind of want to be generic in that way, but then give them the capabilities to write to a CMDB, to tag an asset, to run queries based on what you expect versus what you don't expect. So we definitely do that. We don't do anything like really hard coded to say, here is your score for these, because we want to be able to fit with what all the customers want to do.
Okay, let's dive into questions. Terry, did you want to go through and ask the questions?
Yep, actually what we're going to do is I can make you all live as to ask questions. So I'm actually going to start with you, Karthik. Let me make you live and you can ask your question that you have. Okay, you should be able to talk now.
Okay, very good. Question for Craig. As I listen to all of this, clearly there's a lot of work to be done in terms of assets and identities management. It's all groundwork. Question is, in these times particularly, are CISOs looking for increasing their coverage, new investments, new threat areas, or is it more of doubling down, getting the basics right, and keeping the lights on, so to speak?
Great question. Thanks, Karthik. And I know, by the way, I owe you an email, so there's a cool public call out. I got it. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both, right? I think firstly, you're absolutely right. I think you hit the nail on the head. Doubling down is really important, right? I think it's a balance of both, because what we're trying to do is now we're being forced to identify holes in existing technologies and solutions, right? Particularly, maybe less so from a security perspective, more from an availability point of view, right? Making sure that the business has got what it needs to do what it needs to do and to function correctly. I'm incredibly lucky. I mean, in large organizations like a Fujitsu, you know, our controls are pretty well baked in for this kind of thing. But, you know, my heart goes out to the smaller organizations where perhaps they haven't been in this position before and they really need to invest. And we had a long conversation about this on the last, you know, webcast that we did. So I think, you know, doubling down, making sure that what you've got and the basics are good. But then secondly, you know, you've got to look for areas of facilitating new ways of working. And I also don't think it's a bit like a dog not just being for Christmas, right? I think this is a new normal now. I don't think a lot of it's going to change moving forward. I think a lot of us have experienced working from home. And although we'll get that immediate exodus to run out as soon as everyone lets us out again, I think working patterns are going to change. So I think it's a really good time now for CISOs that perhaps haven't been looking at that stuff, need to look at it now so that they're configured for the future. This isn't a short-time thing. This is going to be a long-term change in terms of the way that we work and the way that we need to secure users. So I think, like anything, right, it depends, but you've got to get that balance right, Karthik.
Okay, and I have another question from Patrick. Patrick, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Couple questions. One of them is, what is the shortfall of a device visibility solution such as Forescout compared to your solution? And then my second question is, do you do anything around operational technology environments, SCADA and that kind of environment?
Sure. So yeah, good question. So we actually integrate with all of the major NAC solutions. And again, it's just a really good source of data, right? But and maybe I'll find someone with an exception here, but I've yet to talk to someone that has a NAC deployed that has it everywhere, right? That has it on every Windows device, every Linux machine, every cloud instance, every mobile device, every, right? So when we end up talking to a customer that has a NAC solution, that is an awesome source of data for us. And we use that data to correlate between every other source of data that we get from the cloud, from your VM infrastructure, from everything else. So if we run into someone that has something like a NAC solution, it's great. And that usually means that they're big enough and mature enough that they've got a lot and they don't have that just one homogeneous environment. And then the second one was OT. Yeah. So if you actually look at our site, you can see all of the adapters we have, and those are the integrations with solutions. And so, yeah, we work with some of the OT solutions. I think, well, off the top of my head, I think Clarity is one of them. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but yeah, we've had that use case quite a bit of connecting to some of the OT solutions out there, and then marrying that data together with everything else. So yep, exactly.
Okay, I don't have any additional questions. Maybe we'll move a little bit further and we'll keep the Q&A open, and then we'll answer those as we go along the way here. But why don't we
I did see one from Ricardo. And it was, I think we might have covered it earlier, but okay. I don't know if Ricardo, you want to ask it?
Ricardo, you go ahead. You're available to talk.
Hey, Corey. Yeah, so the question was more around, I guess, the consideration of assets.
Looks like he dropped off.
Yeah, it's the consideration of assets, and so execs and what devices do they use?
So yeah,
Yeah,
I think that was the intersection of like users, accounts, devices, right? Is that, I think so.
Yeah, I think so. It was, for me, it's interesting. I think we gotta go ahead and clarify. For me, it would be the user, like I'm an asset, my identity is an asset, all of my, obviously my laptop, everything is an asset. And yeah, I think, what more do you guys discover? Obviously OT devices are assets. So you want to kind of go through what you all consider assets and what you were able to consolidate into that?
Yeah, so, okay, yes, Corey's covered it. Okay, good. I just saw him chatting while we were talking. Yeah, so the way that we look at it is we're looking at every device being anything with an IP address, with compute, right? Anything that is either a piece of hardware or a virtual environment. And then we also look at the users that have access to it. So we separate them as entities because a device is something that can either be covered by a security solution, can be scanned, can be on a network, can be accessed by a user. So we separate out the entities, but we look at that intersection to understand who has access to which devices, what is being covered, like how are users using something like an IAM solution. So we definitely look at them all together, but we separate out a user from an actual device or a cloud instance. So we consider them separate entities, but look at how they intersect.
Okay, I think I have one related question. So as if I'm a developer and I spin up, I don't know, 10 new systems while I'm testing a day, how do you manage that? What does that look like in your world?
Yeah, so you're talking about in terms of how we find it or how we classify it, or
yeah, so if you're already set up to connect with AWS and you see all this stuff popping up, is it just a new asset? But how do you know, okay, the asset's no longer gone? So if I'm the CIO or CISO, and I look and I see, hey, now this asset's not there anymore. What happened? What is that? Do you do reports around it? How do you make sure that we as end users have visibility into our assets and we can say, oh, that is, developer just doing that. So how you manage it?
Yeah, so I think there's three things. One is just how we discover everything. And like you said, we do that through those adapters. So anytime, if we're connected to AWS, we'll find out anytime a new instance is spun up, right? And we can grab all that data. The second thing is what we do with queries. So let's say I want to know anytime something is spun up that either has some kind of missing security coverage or is this type of Amazon instance or whatever, right? Anything that you can query, you can just save as a query and then understand what you want to do with it. And then the final thing is the action, right? So what do I want to do when we find something like this? So if I find a new device, maybe I want to send that to ServiceNow and add a new computer. Or we find that a state changes on something. Maybe we want to enrich it with data from something else, or maybe we want to alert someone. So the way that works is, one is just giving that inventory piece. Here's everything you have. The second piece is being able to write queries that translate to policy, so that anytime something changes a state that doesn't match what you expect it to be, then you can decide, I want to alert someone, I want to take action like deploying software, I want to make sure that my VA scanner knows about it to add it to the next scheduled scan. So those are the three pieces. One is just that full inventory piece, just show me what I have. Let me query across all those things to understand anytime something doesn't fit what I expect. And then what do I want to do anytime something fits those queries?
Okay. Awesome. We're going to finish with just best practices. So it will go to Craig, Jeff, and then let you finish, Nathan, with best practices, and
Sure.
I'll say the last few words and we'll be done. So Craig, what are the best practices, from a CISO perspective around asset management? You're smiling like, now I got to figure out all this stuff. But yeah, what do you think?
Well, so I think, my first piece of advice would be do it. It's too hard, right? So no one bothers. So I would say partner with the organization to help do it. I'll let Nathan go through these ones here and just kind of talk about some different bits. I think my biggest piece of advice to any CISO would be always try and piggyback, right? And we've talked about security because we're security guys, but there's loads of other really strong business reasons why asset management is good, right? We talked about cost, cloud cost in the cloud is a big thing, right? How much are we spending from an ROI perspective in the cloud versus on-prem? There's all these other business related conversations that can help to drive an initiative that you can then help to feed into as well. So, security isn't necessarily special. I always look, whenever I'm trying to build a program or look for something I want done, I always look for a business reason to do that. And it might not always be security. Be comfortable that it's getting done, right? Regardless of the reason that it's getting done. And then my last bit would just be walk before you can run, right? I know we get all grandiose about what the hell asset means, but if you start with endpoints and just do endpoints to begin with, I mean, it's a problem solved. I'm a big believer in small iterations will get you to a big goal, right? Don't try and take on this massive, audacious, big, hairy goal. Just do little footsteps. And if you start with IT and desktops, then you move to laptops, then you move to remote, then you move to cloud, whatever it is, right? You've got that big goal in mind, but take those little steps first. So that'd be my key pieces of advice, I think.
Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, to add on what Craig said, I mean, assets are the basic, right? The number one CIS, so if you can't get them right, how can you do the other 19 or get in the NIST or the frameworks? So to me, it's really key, and it can be a cost saver. If you know what your assets are, you know where they're at, and a consumption, then you could actually drive down costs and secure at the same time.
Great. And then Nathan, I'll let you kind of walk through your asset slide here.
Yeah, so these are things that whenever we're talking about asset management and the things that you're trying to answer, these are the 6 questions that come up around anything, right? So is it known and managed? So the difference between an unmanaged device versus something that is just either has an agent installed, is missing something, right? Where is it? What is it? Is the core software up to date? What else is installed? And then the bigger one, which is admittedly different than the rest, is does it adhere to my security policy? So whether you're talking about asset management in the context of what we do at Axonius or just more general, I think these are 6 questions that always come up that people are always trying to answer about any kind of asset, on-prem, cloud, whatever.
All right, well, fantastic. So appreciate you guys for this session. One last thing I'll say from a Cybertalk perspective, every engagement that we do, and especially where it makes sense, we're building in an IT asset assessment, kind of an audit, because if we're coming in to do threat and vulnerability management or any other project, it's table stakes. If we don't know what that end customer has, guaranteed they don't know what they have either. So we come in, and what we love about your tool is that it's really easy to use and get up and going. You can get somebody up and going in a really short amount of time, and allows us to really see what's there and verify what is there. And what we've seen, so far, every time we do that, then the customer realizes, wow, I did not know of all these assets and that I could get visibility this easily. And then it turns into really the next step. But it's key for us to be successful because we cannot secure our customers if we don't know what they have. And to the point we made on this presentation today is that most CISOs don't know what they have already. And, me from the outside, being a vendor, we always are asking scoping questions, how many assets do you have? And they have no freaking idea. It's always a ballpark. And so we want to help solve that and also help solve the security challenges at the same time. That's been our approach. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for joining, and